The Devil in the White City. I arrived in Chicago on the first train that morning. The city's skyline looming above the mist, its towers a promise of opportunity. The World's Fair was the talk of the nation. An unparalleled event, they said, full of marvels that would redefine the future. I had come from a small town in search of just that, the future. Little did I know I was about to step into something far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. As I walked through the crowded streets, the scent of fresh bread and roasting meats filled the air. Hawkers called out from every corner, their voices mingling with the clatter of horses' hooves on cobblestone. My eyes were drawn to the towering Ferris wheel in the distance, the centerpiece of the fair. It gleamed like a giant halo in the afternoon sun, a promise of adventure and wonder. But it wasn't the Ferris wheel that caught my attention next. No, it was the dark silhouette of a hotel just a block away from the fairgrounds. It was different from the other buildings. Darker, more imposing. Something about it felt off, yet I couldn't resist. After all, I needed a place to stay, and it was convenient. How lucky, I thought, to find lodging so close to the fair. The hotel's sign hung crooked above the door. Asterisk the World's Fair Hotel asterisk. Simple, unassuming. The lobby was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of old wood and something metallic that I couldn't quite place. The man behind the counter greeted me with a broad smile. His eyes, though, didn't match the warmth of his expression. They were cold, calculating. "I trust you're here for the fair?" he asked, his voice smooth as silk. I nodded, suddenly feeling uneasy but unable to pinpoint why. "Well, you're in luck," he said. "We have just the room for you. Quiet, private, perfect for a man looking for some peace after a day at the fair." He handed me a key with a brass tag, room 307. I thanked him and headed for the staircase. As I climbed the narrow, winding steps, the creak of the wood beneath my feet seemed louder than it should have been. The air grew colder with every floor, and by the time I reached the third, I could see my breath fogging in front of me. Room 307 was at the end of a long, dimly lit hallway. I inserted the key into the lock, and the door swung open with a heavy groan. The room was small, sparsely furnished, with a single bed, a writing desk, and a wardrobe. The wallpaper was peeling in places, revealing dark stains beneath. A draft slipped through the cracks in the window, sending a shiver down my spine. I set my suitcase on the bed and unpacked, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. I told myself it was just the newness of the city, the unfamiliarity of the place. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. There was something wrong with this hotel, something I couldn't explain. That night, after a long day at the fair, I returned to the hotel exhausted. The fair had been everything I'd hoped for. Bright, loud, full of life. But the moment I stepped through the hotel doors, that vibrant energy was sucked away, replaced by a deep, oppressive silence. The lobby was empty, the front desk abandoned. I climbed the stairs again, the creaks beneath my feet now sounding more like groans of pain. When I reached the third floor, the hallway was darker than before, as if the light bulbs had dimmed on their own. I hurried to room 307, desperate to lock the door behind me. But sleep didn't come easy. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't quiet. The shadows in the room seemed to move, shifting in the corners of my vision. And then I heard it, a faint scraping sound like nails on wood coming from inside the walls. I froze, holding my breath, straining to hear. There it was again, closer this time. Scraping, scratching, and then breathing. Heavy, labored breathing. It was coming from the wardrobe. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly got out of bed, my feet cold against the wooden floor. The air felt thick, suffocating as I crept toward the wardrobe. My hands shook as I reached for the handle, every instinct screaming at me to run, to get out of this room and never look back. But something stronger, a morbid curiosity perhaps, pushed me forward. I pulled the door open. There was nothing inside, just darkness. But the smell, the metallic scent that had lingered in the air since I arrived, it was stronger now, overwhelming. The kind of smell that turns your stomach and makes your skin crawl. Blood, the unmistakable scent of blood. Suddenly the wardrobe door slammed shut on its own, nearly trapping my hand inside. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. And then from the other side of the door, I heard a voice. Low, raspy, dripping with malice. "Welcome to my castle." The room plunged into darkness as the light bulb above shattered, and I was left standing in the pitch black, with only the sound of my own ragged breathing and the soft, sinister chuckle echoing through the walls. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the wardrobe door slamming shut, heard that voice whispering from the darkness. "Welcome to my castle." The words echoed in my mind, growing louder until they drowned out everything else. By morning I was a wreck, pale, shaking, barely able to think straight, but I had to leave. I couldn't stay in that room another second. I threw my clothes into my suitcase, not bothering to fold them, and bolted for the door. As I reached for the doorknob, I hesitated. Something felt wrong. The air was thick again, pressing down on me, and the room was colder than it had been even in the dead of night. But I couldn't stay. I flung the door open and stumbled into the hallway, my breath coming in gasps as I hurried toward the staircase. The hallway seemed longer now, stretching on and on, the walls narrowing as if they were closing in on me. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, and I realized with horror that I was the only sound. No creaks, no distant chatter from other guests, just silence. Too much silence. I finally made it to the stairs and practically flew down them, not stopping until I reached the lobby. To my surprise, the man from the front desk was there, standing perfectly still behind the counter, watching me with that same unsettling smile. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his voice smooth but with an edge that made my skin prickle. I stammered something about needing to catch a train, about changing my plans. Anything to get out of that conversation as quickly as possible. But he didn't move, didn't blink. "You've only just arrived," he said, his smile widening ever so slightly. "Are you sure you've seen all the wonders our hotel has to offer?" A tremor of fear shot through me. I forced myself to nod, muttering that I had indeed, and that I needed to be on my way. But even as I spoke, I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't talking about the hotel's amenities. He was talking about something far darker, something that lurked in the shadows of this cursed place. I turned and headed for the door, half expecting him to call out after me to stop me. But he didn't. I reached the exit and pushed against it, but the door didn't budge. Panic surged through me as I shoved harder, but it was locked, sealed shut as if it had never been opened in the first place. A sickening feeling twisted in my gut, and I turned back to the front desk. The man was gone. Vanished as if he had never been there. The lobby was empty, and the silence returned, thick and oppressive. I was trapped. I ran back to the stairs, my mind racing. If the front door was locked, maybe there was another way out. A back exit, a fire escape, anything. I flew up the steps 2 at a time, my breath burning in my lungs as I reached the 3rd floor again. The hallway seemed even darker now, the walls closing in around me. I turned the corner and froze. Standing at the far end of the hallway was a woman. Her back was to me, her long dark hair hanging limply around her shoulders. She wore a pale blue dress, the fabric torn and stained with something dark. Something that looked far too much like blood. "Ma'am?" I called out, my voice shaking. She didn't respond, just stood there completely still. I took a step closer, and that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The woman wasn't standing on the floor. She was hovering, just a few inches above the ground. Her feet were bare, dangling in the air as if some invisible force was holding her up. Slowly she began to turn, and as her face came into view, I felt a scream rise in my throat. Her eyes were wide open, lifeless and glassy, her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. Blood dripped from a deep gash in her throat, staining the front of her dress. She stared at me with that awful, frozen grin, and then in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, she spoke. "He'll find you." I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet as I turned and ran. Her voice followed me, growing louder, echoing off the walls until it was all I could hear. "He'll find you. He'll find you. He'll find you." I burst into my room, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I leaned against the door, gasping for breath, my mind racing. Who was she? What was she? I glanced around the room, half expecting something else to be waiting for me in the shadows. But the room was empty. The wardrobe stood silently in the corner, its door slightly ajar. I quickly moved to close it, not wanting to see what lay inside. And then I noticed something on the floor. A small, folded piece of paper. It hadn't been there before. I knelt down and picked it up, my hands shaking as I unfolded it. The message scrawled in dark, jagged letters sent a shiver down my spine. "Asterisk, you can't leave. Not until he's done with you. Asterisk." I dropped the paper, stumbling back as if it had burned me. The walls seemed to close in around me, the room growing darker, colder. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift, moving ever so slightly, as if something, or someone, was hiding just out of sight. And then, from somewhere deep within the hotel, I heard it. The same low, sinister chuckle that had haunted me last night. It echoed through the walls, growing louder, closer. The room seemed to vibrate with the sound, and I realized with a sickening dread that I wasn't alone. Something was coming for me, something that wouldn't stop until it had me in its grasp. I bolted for the door, but just as my hand touched the doorknob, the lights flickered and went out. The darkness was absolute, suffocating. And then in the pitch black, I heard it again. That voice, low and rasping, whispering in my ear. "Welcome to my castle." The darkness swallowed me whole, every corner of the room turning into an abyss. My breath was ragged, shallow as I fumbled for the door. The voice was so close, too close, as if it were right behind me. I could almost feel hot breath on the back of my neck, the sensation prickling my skin. I yanked at the doorknob, desperate to escape, but the door wouldn't budge. No matter how hard I pulled, it remained locked. as if some invisible force was holding it shut. The chuckle came again, low and rumbling, echoing through the walls. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I could feel my pulse thudding in my throat. It was playing with me, whatever this thing was. I could feel it, sense it watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Suddenly the darkness seemed to shift. Something moved in the shadows, just out of sight. I spun around, my eyes straining to see, but all I could make out was a faint outline. Tall, unnaturally tall, and looming over me. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The room felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing closer, suffocating me. And then the lights flickered back on, but only for a brief moment. Just enough time for me to see what was standing in the corner. It wasn't human. At least, not anymore. The figure was twisted, deformed, its skin gray and mottled, stretched tight over bone. Its eyes were hollow, black pits, and its mouth was unnaturally wide, a gaping maw filled with jagged yellow teeth. It smiled at me, that same grotesque grin that I had seen on the woman in the hallway. But this smile was different. This smile was hungry. I froze, terror paralyzing me as the creature took a step forward. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as if savoring every second of my fear. It reached out a long, bony hand, its fingers ending in sharp black claws. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. I was trapped, rooted to the spot by sheer, unrelenting terror. The lights flickered again, plunging the room into darkness once more. In the pitch black, I could hear it. Its slow, deliberate breathing, the scrape of its claws against the floor as it moved closer. My mind was racing, desperate for a way out, but every thought was clouded by fear. I pressed myself against the door, frantically searching for the doorknob again, but it was gone. The door was gone. The walls, the floor, everything was gone. All that was left was the darkness and the sound of the creature getting closer and closer. And then, just when I thought it was over, the lights flickered on again. But this time, the creature wasn't there. The room was empty. The wardrobe stood in the corner. The bed was untouched and the door was back in its place. Everything looked normal, but I knew better. I wasn't safe. Not yet. I rushed to the door and flung it open, half expecting to see the creature waiting for me on the other side. But the hallway was empty. The only sound was the distant hum of the city outside, muffled by the thick walls of the hotel. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, and stepped into the hallway. That's when I saw it, the trail of blood. It led down the hallway, smeared along the floor and walls, as if something or someone had been dragged. My stomach churned as I followed it, every step bringing me closer to the source of the horror. The hallway seemed longer than before, stretching on endlessly, and the further I went, the stronger the metallic scent of blood became. Finally, I reached the end of the hall where the trail of blood led to a door. Room 313. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness peeking through the crack. I hesitated for a moment, every instinct telling me to turn back, to run. But something compelled me forward, something stronger than fear. Curiosity, maybe, or the desperate need for answers. I pushed the door open. The room was a nightmare. Blood covered the walls, splattered across the floor, dripping from the ceiling. The stench was overwhelming, choking, and in the center of the room was a body. What was left of it, at least. Torn apart, limbs scattered across the room, the torso barely recognizable as human. And in the middle of it all, standing over the mangled remains, was the man from the front desk. He looked up at me, his face smeared with blood, and smiled that same unsettling smile. But this time his eyes weren't cold and calculating. They were empty, completely black, like the eyes of the creature I had seen earlier. His smile widened as he stepped toward me, his hands dripping with blood. "I told you," he said, his voice low and guttural. "You can't leave. Not until he's done with you." I stumbled back, my mind reeling. The walls seemed to close in again, the room spinning around me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. And then from the shadows I saw it again. The creature, its twisted form emerging from the darkness. It moved toward me, its claws scraping against the floor, its black eyes locked onto mine. I turned and ran, down the hallway, past the bloodstained walls, down the stairs. The creature's growls echoed behind me, growing louder, closer. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. When I reached the lobby, it was empty again. The front door was still locked, the windows dark and impenetrable. But then I saw it, a narrow door behind the front desk, one I hadn't noticed before. A back exit, maybe, a way out. I raced toward it, the creature's growls just behind me, and flung the door open. It led to a narrow staircase, spiraling down into the darkness. I didn't hesitate. I ran down the stairs, the air growing colder with every step, the walls narrowing around me. Finally, I reached the bottom. The door at the end of the staircase creaked open as I pushed against it, revealing a long, dimly lit corridor. The air was damp, musty, and the sound of dripping water echoed off the stone walls. I stepped into the corridor, my breath coming in shallow gasps, and that's when I realized I wasn't in the hotel anymore. I was in the basement of the Murder Castle. The cold, damp air clung to my skin as I stood frozen at the entrance to the corridor. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the nightmare unfolding around me. The Murder Castle, the stories I had heard, dark rumors whispered among the locals, tales of a madman who had turned this place into a labyrinth of death. But I had dismissed them as just that, stories. Yet now, standing here, I realized how horribly real it all was. The corridor stretched out before me, dimly lit by a series of flickering gas lamps mounted on the stone walls. The floor was slick with moisture, and the air reeked of rot and decay. My footsteps echoed as I cautiously moved forward, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But there was no going back. Not now. Not after everything I had seen. I had to keep moving. I had to find a way out of this nightmare. The corridor twisted and turned, narrowing with every step. The walls were damp, slick with something I didn't want to think too much about. The air grew colder the deeper I went. The oppressive silence broken only by the distant drip of water and the low, ominous hum that seemed to vibrate through the stone. And then I heard it again. The slow, deliberate scraping of claws against the floor. The creature was still following me, stalking me through the labyrinth of corridors, always just out of sight but never far behind. My heart pounded in my chest as I quickened my pace, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of escape. The corridor opened up into a larger chamber, and I stopped dead in my tracks. The room was filled with devices, torture devices, rusted iron cages, chains dangling from the ceiling, a rack stretched out in the center of the room, and on the far wall, shelves lined with glass jars. My stomach churned as I realized what was inside them. Organs, preserved in some foul liquid, floating like grotesque trophies. The room was suffused with the stench of death. It clung to the walls, embedded deep in the stone. Bloodstains, old and new, painted the floor and the walls, and in the far corner, a pile of bones, human bones, was stacked haphazardly, like discarded remnants of some macabre feast. Suddenly, a soft, wet sound caught my attention. I turned and my breath caught in my throat. There, in the corner of the room, sat a woman, barely alive, her body twisted and broken. Her eyes were wide with terror, her lips moving in a frantic whisper that I couldn't make out. Her skin was pale, slick with sweat, and dark bruises marred her arms and legs. But it was her face that truly horrified me. Her eyes had been gouged out. I took a step toward her, wanting to help, to do something, anything. But as I approached, her frantic whispers became clearer.
"Don't stay! He's coming! He's coming!"
A chill ran down my spine, and I turned just in time to see the shadow moving toward me. The creature. It was larger now, more grotesque, its form twisted and contorted beyond recognition. Its black eyes glistened in the dim light, and its gaping maw dripped with something dark and viscous. I backed away, my heart pounding in my ears. The woman's whispers had turned into a frantic, panicked chant, repeating the same words over and over again. "He's coming! He's coming! He's coming!" The creature lunged at me, its claws slashing through the air. I ducked and ran, scrambling for the nearest passageway, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The corridors twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the heart of the castle. I could hear the creature behind me, its growls growing louder, its claws scraping against the stone walls as it closed in. I rounded a corner and stopped dead in my tracks. The corridor ended in a dead end. There was nowhere to go. I was trapped. Panic surged through me as I turned to face the creature. It loomed at the far end of the corridor, its twisted form filling the narrow space. Its black eyes locked onto mine, and it smiled, its mouth stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. And then it spoke, in that same low, rasping voice that had haunted me since the first night. "You can't escape. No one ever does." I pressed myself against the wall, desperate for some way out. But there was nothing. The creature took a step forward, and then another, its claws scraping against the stone floor. I could feel its breath on my skin, hot and rancid as it loomed over me. Just as I thought it was over, I noticed something. A small crack in the wall behind me, barely visible in the dim light. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and pushed against it. The wall shifted just slightly, and then, with a grinding sound, a hidden door slid open. I didn't hesitate. I threw myself through the opening and into the darkness beyond, just as the creature lunged at me. The door slammed shut behind me, sealing the creature on the other side. I collapsed on the cold stone floor, gasping for breath. The air was still, silent, and for the first time since I had entered the basement, I felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I had escaped. But that hope was short-lived. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized that I wasn't alone. The room I had stumbled into wasn't empty. Rows of metal tables lined the walls, each one covered with a sheet. And beneath those sheets, I could see the outlines of bodies. Dozens of them. A soft, wet sound filled the room, the sound of something moving beneath one of the sheets. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, as the sheet slowly slid off the table, revealing the body beneath. It was a man, his skin pale and mottled, his eyes wide open, staring straight at me. And then slowly he began to sit up. I scrambled to my feet, backing away as the man's body twisted and contorted, his bones cracking as he moved. His mouth opened, and a low, guttural sound escaped his throat, a sound that made my blood run cold. I turned to run, but the door behind me was gone. The walls were closing in, the room growing smaller and smaller, until there was nowhere left to go. The bodies on the tables were moving now, all of them sitting up, their eyes fixed on me. And then I heard it, a voice, low and rasping, coming from all around me. You can't escape, no one ever does. The room plunged into darkness, and in the pitch black, I felt them. Cold, bony hands grabbing at me, pulling me down. The last thing I heard before the darkness swallowed me whole was the sound of that low, sinister chuckle echoing through the air. And then silence. The end.